They said, "We don't need you anymore." So I left without a word. Months later, they were all sitting outside my house, crying, begging, and waiting for one last chance. But after everything they had done, would I ever open the door again? The truth they discovered changed their lives forever. The day my family told me they didn't need me anymore, the house was strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that makes your heart race before anyone says a single word. I had just come home after working a 12-hour shift at the local repair shop. My hands smelled of machine oil, and my back ached the way it had every evening for nearly 30 years. I walked into the kitchen expecting to hear my wife, Linda, humming while making dinner. Instead, my son Daniel, my daughter Emily, and Linda were already sitting at the dining table. No food, no smiles, just silence. "Sit down," Daniel said. His voice carried none of the respect it once had. I looked from one face to another. "What's going on?" Linda folded her hands together but refused to meet my eyes. Emily stared at her phone. Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, we've talked about this for weeks. I don't know what you're talking about." He took a deep breath. "We think it's time you leave." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I looked at Linda. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't defending me. She simply whispered, "Maybe it's for the best." My chest tightened. "Leave? My own home?" Daniel sighed impatiently. "It's not really your home anymore." Those words hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. This house. I looked around the room I'd painted myself. The staircase I'd built. The kitchen cabinets I'd installed on weekends because we couldn't afford contractors. I spent 27 years paying for this place. Daniel shrugged. "Things change." Emily finally looked up. "You make everything uncomfortable." I stared at her in disbelief. "I do." She nodded. "You're always reminding us how hard you worked." "I wasn't reminding you. You were making us feel guilty." Linda finally spoke. "We're ready to move on." Move on. As though I had already become part of the past. I looked at each of them, hoping someone would say it was a mistake. Nobody did. Daniel slid an envelope across the table. "We found you a small apartment." I didn't even touch it. "So you've planned all of this?" "Weeks. Maybe months." Behind my back, Linda quietly nodded. "We thought this would be easier." "Easier for who?" Nobody answered. I stood there for what felt like forever. Then something inside me changed. Not anger. Not hatred. Just exhaustion. Years of sacrifice suddenly felt invisible. Every overtime shift. Every birthday I missed because I was working. Every vacation we couldn't afford because I wanted my children to have better schools. None of it mattered anymore. I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because I finally understood. I walked upstairs, packed one suitcase, left my wedding ring on the dresser, wrote 6 words on a piece of paper. "I hope life gives you peace." Then I walked out the front door. No shouting, no revenge, no dramatic speech. I simply left. For the next few weeks, nobody called. Nobody asked if I was alive. Nobody wondered whether I had enough money to eat. I rented the smallest apartment I'd ever seen. The bedroom barely fit a single bed. The kitchen sink leaked. The heating barely worked. But for the first time in years, there was peace. Every morning I made coffee, read old books, worked my shifts, came home, and slowly, I remembered who I had been before life became nothing but responsibility. One rainy evening, while fixing an old motorcycle in the shop, an elderly customer watched me work. "You've got gifted hands," he said. I smiled, politely. 30 years of practice. He introduced himself. "My name is Arthur Bennett." He owned a manufacturing company that restored vintage machinery. Business had been struggling. His lead technician had just retired. "I need someone honest." I laughed softly. "Honest people don't make companies rich." Arthur smiled. "They keep them alive." A week later, he offered me a job. The salary was nearly double what I had been earning. Health benefits, paid vacations, profit sharing. I almost refused. Not because I didn't want it. Because after everything that had happened, I had forgotten what it felt like to be valued. Arthur looked at me. "Someone convinced you that your worth depends on what other people think." I couldn't answer. He continued. "I don't hire resumes. I hire character." That sentence changed something inside me. I accepted, and my life slowly began to change. For the first time in decades, people thanked me, respected me, asked for my opinion. Months passed. The lonely man who left his family behind slowly disappeared. I exercised again, started reading, even laughed, something I hadn't done in years. Arthur eventually trusted me enough to manage an entire restoration division. The business flourished, customers returned, profits increased. One afternoon he called me into his office. "I've been thinking." I smiled. "That's usually dangerous." He laughed. "I'm 74. I have no children. I've decided to retire." I congratulated him. Then he slid a thick folder across his desk. "I want you to run everything." I blinked. "I think you misunderstood." "No, I understand perfectly. I've spent my entire life looking for someone I could trust. And I finally found him." I stared at the papers. It wasn't just a promotion. Arthur was offering me a partnership, a future, a life I had never imagined. Meanwhile, across town, the family who once said they didn't need me anymore had no idea what was happening. Because while they believed they had gotten rid of their biggest burden, they were about to discover they had pushed away the one person who had quietly held everything together. 3 months after I walked away, my new life barely resembled the old one. Each morning I arrived at Bennett Restoration Works before sunrise. The old brick building, once quiet and struggling, had become full of life again. Machines that had sat idle for years were humming. Customers who had left were returning because they knew one thing: if we accepted a job, we finished it with honesty. Arthur often smiled as he watched the workshop. "You've given this place a second life," he told me one afternoon. I shook my head. "No, you gave me one." He laughed. "Sometimes people save each other." Those words stayed with me. For years I had believed that my only purpose was to sacrifice everything for my family. Without them, I thought I would become nothing. Instead, I discovered something surprising. I was still capable, still respected, still valuable. One Friday afternoon, Arthur handed me a set of keys. "What are these?" "Your office." I stared at him. "I don't need an office." "Exactly," he replied. "That's why you deserve one." I smiled for the first time in a long while. Across town, things inside my old house were changing. At first, Daniel enjoyed the freedom. Nobody reminded him to save money. Nobody questioned expensive purchases. Nobody suggested fixing things instead of replacing them. He bought a luxury SUV on credit. Emily quit another job because she didn't like her manager. Linda spent more than ever, believing life would somehow work itself out. Then reality arrived. The roof began leaking during a heavy storm. The heating system stopped working. The plumbing failed. For years, I had quietly repaired every problem before anyone even noticed. Now every repair required thousands of dollars. Bills piled up. Arguments became louder. One evening Daniel slammed a stack of unpaid invoices onto the kitchen table. "Why is everything breaking?" Linda whispered. "Your father always handled these things." Silence filled the room. No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. They had never appreciated everything I did. Meanwhile, Arthur and I traveled to several cities to meet new clients. Business expanded faster than either of us expected. One afternoon, after signing a major contract, Arthur looked at me with a serious expression. "I've updated my will." I frowned. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you're in it." I stared at him. "I can't accept that." "You don't have to accept anything today," he said calmly. "Just know that you've become family to me." Family. The word almost hurt. Not because of Arthur. Because of the people who had thrown me away. A few weeks later, I stopped at a grocery store after work. As I reached for a loaf of bread, I heard a familiar voice. "David." I froze. Slowly, I turned around. Linda. She looked different. Older. More tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she forced a small smile. "You look, well." "I am." She looked surprised by my answer. "I heard you're working for Arthur Bennett." "I am. They say business is doing really well. We've been fortunate." She hesitated before asking, "Would you, maybe come by the house sometime?" I looked at her quietly. "Why?" "We just thought." She couldn't finish the sentence. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Months ago, she had watched me walk away without stopping me. Now she didn't know how to ask me to come back. "I'm sorry," I said gently. "I have somewhere else to be." I wished her well and walked away. I never looked back. That evening Linda returned home. Daniel immediately asked, "Did you see him?" She nodded. "Well, he's doing fine." Daniel frowned. "Did he say he'd help us?" "No." Emily looked up from the sofa. "So he just walked away?" Linda answered quietly. "That's exactly what we asked him to do." No one spoke after that. The following month brought even worse news. Daniel's company announced layoffs. His position was eliminated. He came home carrying a cardboard box filled with his belongings. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Emily's freelance business also collapsed after losing several major clients. Within weeks, the family was struggling financially. The mortgage payments fell behind. Credit card debt kept growing. Stress turned every conversation into an argument. One night Daniel shouted, "If Dad were here, he'd know what to do." The words echoed through the house. Linda closed her eyes. "He was here," she whispered. "We were the ones who pushed him away." At the workshop, life continued moving forward. Arthur introduced me to investors. We opened another restoration facility. New employees joined every month. One Friday, he invited me to dinner. After dessert, he slid another envelope across the table. I laughed. "You always hand me life-changing papers over food." He smiled. "Open it." Inside was the deed to a beautiful countryside home. I looked at him in disbelief. "Arthur, I've already paid for it." "I can't." "Yes, you can. You've spent your entire life giving people a place to feel safe. It's time someone gave you one." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Not because of the house. Because someone believed I deserved happiness. As I stood on the porch of my new home weeks later, watching the sunset across the fields, I finally felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Real peace. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need my family to suffer. I only wanted to live without bitterness. But life wasn't finished with us yet. Because just as I settled into my new beginning, a letter arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer. It wasn't from a bank. It was from Daniel. Inside was only one sentence. "Dad, I finally understand what we lost. Please give us one chance to explain." I folded the letter carefully. Then I looked out across the quiet countryside. For the first time since leaving, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I read Daniel's letter 3 times. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. Just one sentence. "Dad, I finally understand what we lost. Please give us one chance to explain." Months earlier, I would have rushed to answer. I would have convinced myself that they had changed overnight. But pain teaches patience. I folded the letter and placed it inside my desk drawer. Not because I wanted to ignore it. Because I needed time. The next morning, Arthur noticed I was unusually quiet. "Something on your mind?" my son wrote to me. Arthur nodded but didn't interrupt. "He wants another chance." "And what do you want?" I stared out the office window. "I honestly don't know." Arthur smiled gently. "Forgiveness doesn't always mean returning to the life that hurt you." Those words stayed with me all day. Back at my old house, things continued to fall apart. The bank had sent another warning about the overdue mortgage. Daniel had applied for dozens of jobs but received only a handful of interviews. Emily finally admitted that she had exhausted her savings. Linda quietly sold several pieces of jewelry to keep the lights on. One evening, while cleaning the attic, Emily discovered a dusty cardboard box with my handwriting on it. Curious, she opened it. Inside were old notebooks, receipts, medical bills, school fee statements, letters. At the bottom lay a small journal. She opened the first page. "If I work 2 extra shifts every week, Daniel can stay in college without taking student loans." Her hands trembled. She turned another page. "Sold my motorcycle today. Emily deserves the piano lessons she loves." Another page. "Doctor says I should rest because of my back. That will have to wait. The kids need new winter coats." Tears filled her eyes. She kept reading. There wasn't a single complaint. Not one sentence blaming anyone. Only plans, sacrifices, hope. She carried the journal downstairs without saying a word. Linda began reading. Halfway through, she broke down crying. Daniel took the notebook next. With every page, the confident man who had once told me to leave seemed to disappear. For the first time, they saw the life I had quietly lived. Meanwhile, our company celebrated another major success. Arthur gathered everyone in the workshop. "I have an announcement." The employees applauded as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "From today forward, David is officially the president of Bennett Restoration Works." The room erupted with cheers. I wasn't expecting the standing ovation. Men and women I'd worked beside for months shook my hand one after another. One mechanic smiled. "You believed in us before we believed in ourselves." I realized something. Respect can't be demanded, it must be earned. A week later, I received another letter. This time it wasn't from Daniel. It was from Emily. Inside was a photograph. It showed me teaching her how to ride a bicycle when she was 6 years old. On the back she had written, "I spent years remembering only the mistakes you made. I forgot the thousand things you did right. I'm so sorry, Dad. For several minutes I simply stared at the picture. The little girl smiling in that photograph no longer existed. Life had changed us both. Days later, there was another knock on my front door. When I opened it, I found Linda standing alone. She looked exhausted. I didn't come to ask for money. I remained silent. I came because I owe you the truth. She took a deep breath. When the children started saying you were old-fashioned, I should have defended you. I didn't. When they said the house would be happier without you, I stayed quiet. I thought keeping everyone happy was the same as doing the right thing. It wasn't. Tears rolled down her face. I failed you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said quietly, the hardest part wasn't leaving. She looked up. It was realizing nobody asked me to stay. She covered her mouth as tears fell freely. I know. I'm sorry. She turned and slowly walked back toward her car. I watched until she disappeared down the road. That evening, I opened the drawer containing Daniel's first letter. Beside it now rested Emily's photograph, and the memory of Linda's apology. For months I had believed my heart had turned to stone. But perhaps it hadn't. Perhaps it had simply learned to protect itself. Still, one question remained unanswered. Could a broken family ever become whole again? I didn't know, but life was about to force us all to find out. A week after Linda visited, I thought the story was finally over. I was wrong. Early on a cold Saturday morning, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, I froze. Daniel, Emily, Linda, all three were standing on my porch. None of them spoke. They looked nothing like the confident people who had once told me they didn't need me. Their eyes were red from crying. Daniel stepped forward first. Dad, his voice cracked, we're not here to ask for money. We're not here to ask for your house. We're here because we've spent months realizing what we destroyed. I remained silent. Emily held out the old journal she had found in the attic. I've read every page. She wiped away tears. I never knew how many dreams you gave up so we could have ours. Linda looked at me. I should have stood beside you. I didn't. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. For several moments, only the wind moved between us. Finally, Daniel fell to his knees. I'm sorry, Dad. I thought providing money made me successful. You showed us that providing love makes a family. I didn't understand until you were gone. Emily knelt beside him, then Linda. The three people who had once watched me leave without a word were now sitting outside my house. Crying, begging, waiting for one last chance. Exactly as life had written it. I looked at them for a long time. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, only sadness. Then I quietly said, stand up. They slowly rose. I forgave you months ago. They looked at me in disbelief. But forgiveness, I continued, doesn't erase consequences. Daniel lowered his head. I know. You told me I wasn't needed. So I built a life where I was. Emily whispered, we don't expect everything to go back to the way it was. I'm glad, because it can't. Silence settled over us again. Then I stepped aside. Come inside, not because everything was fixed. Because healing has to begin somewhere. Over coffee, we talked for hours. Not about money, not about blame, about truth. For the first time in years, everyone listened instead of arguing. Daniel admitted that pride had blinded him. Emily confessed that she had judged me without understanding the sacrifices behind every decision. Linda apologized again, not with excuses, but with honesty. When they finally prepared to leave, Daniel looked around my home. You've built a beautiful life. I smiled. It took losing everything to discover what really mattered. Months passed. We didn't become a perfect family overnight. Trust returned slowly. Phone calls became regular. Sunday lunches became a tradition. No one pretended the past hadn't happened. Instead, we learned from it. Arthur often joined us. He laughed when he saw my family helping cook dinner. Looks like you've got a full house again. I smiled. Yes, but this time, everyone wants to be here. Arthur passed away peacefully the following spring. He left Bennett Restoration Works in my care, exactly as he had promised. At his memorial service, I spoke only one sentence that truly mattered. He reminded me that your value is never decided by the people who fail to appreciate you. Everyone stood in silence, because they knew it was true. Years later, Daniel became a mentor to young fathers, teaching them never to mistake success for love. Emily opened a community center that helped elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. Linda volunteered there every week. As for me, I finally retired, not because I had to, Because I wanted to. One warm evening, my grandchildren ran across the yard laughing. One of them climbed onto my lap and asked, "Grandpa, what's the most important thing you've ever learned?" I looked toward the sunset. Then I smiled. Never measure someone's worth by what they can give you. One day, you'll discover that the quietest person in the room was carrying the heaviest load all along. The child nodded, though I knew they were still too young to understand. Maybe one day they would. Maybe they wouldn't, but I hoped they would always remember one thing. A family isn't held together by money, success, or pride. It's held together by gratitude, respect, and love. And once those are lost, winning them back is the hardest journey of all. 5 years passed. Life had become quieter than I ever imagined. The wounds that once divided our family had not disappeared, but they had healed into scars that reminded us never to repeat the same mistakes. Every Sunday, my home was filled with laughter. Daniel always arrived early, carrying fresh bread from the bakery. Emily brought homemade desserts with her children. Linda, now my closest friend again, helped set the table before anyone else arrived. One afternoon, Daniel pulled me aside. "Dad, I need to show you something." He handed me a folder. Inside was the deed to my old family home. I looked at him in surprise. "You bought it back?" He nodded. "I didn't buy it because I wanted to live there. I bought it because it belongs to the man who built it." My hands trembled. "I can't accept this." "You accepted losing everything without complaining," Daniel said. "Please let us do this one thing." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Emily stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "When we forced you out, we thought the house made a family." She smiled sadly. "We were wrong. You were the home." Those words broke the last wall around my heart. I hugged both of my children tightly. No one spoke. No one needed to. Some apologies are too deep for words. Months later, we gathered at the old house one final time. Instead of moving back in, I made a different decision. "We're donating this house." Everyone looked at me in shock. "There are too many elderly people who have nowhere to go. I want this house to become a place where no parent is ever told, 'We don't need you anymore.'" Daniel smiled through tears. Emily nodded. Linda squeezed my hand. Within a year, the house became a small community home for abandoned seniors. The first residents arrived carrying little more than suitcases and memories. But they were welcomed with kindness, warm meals, and dignity. Standing at the entrance on opening day, I looked at the sign above the door. "Second Chance House." Arthur's photograph hung proudly in the lobby beside a simple plaque. "A person's greatest wealth is not what they own, but the lives they lift." As the sun set that evening, children played in the garden while elderly residents smiled from the porch. For the first time in decades, I looked around and realized something. The family that once broke my heart had helped build something beautiful from its mistakes. Sometimes life doesn't give us the ending we expected. Sometimes, it gives us a better one. It had been nearly 10 years since the day I walked out of my family's house with a single suitcase. Life had become peaceful. Second Chance House had grown from a small shelter into one of the most respected homes for abandoned seniors in the state. Volunteers came every weekend. Schools brought students to spend time with the residents. Families who had once ignored the elderly now came to learn from them. One rainy afternoon, I was cleaning my office when I found an old wooden box tucked away on the top shelf. Inside were faded photographs, Arthur's pocket watch, and one sealed envelope. Written across the front, in Arthur's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Open only when you truly believe your work is finished." I smiled. "Arthur, you're still giving me surprises." Carefully, I broke the seal. The letter inside read, "David, if you're reading this, then I know you've finally found peace. Years ago, when you walked into my workshop, I didn't hire you because you were the best mechanic. I hired you because I saw a man who had spent his entire life putting others before himself. I also knew something you didn't. The people who rejected you would one day need your example far more than they ever needed your money. Never let bitterness become your legacy. Let kindness be the inheritance you leave behind." By the time I reached the last line, tears blurred the words. Arthur had understood my future before I ever could. At that moment, there was another knock at the office door. Daniel stepped inside with a smile. "Dad, there's someone here who wants to meet you." Outside stood a young man in his 20s. He looked nervous. "My name is Michael," he said. "My grandfather lived here during the last 2 years of his life. He always told me you saved him." I shook my head. "No. We just gave him a place to stay." Michael smiled. "You gave him a family." He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of his grandfather laughing with the other residents during a summer picnic. On the back, a single sentence was written. "Thank you for proving that being forgotten doesn't mean being unloved." I looked around the garden. Residents were laughing, children were playing, families were reunited. In that moment, I realized the greatest revenge had never been success. It had been choosing compassion over resentment. And that choice had changed far more lives than I could have imagined. Autumn arrived quietly. The trees surrounding Second Chance House glowed in shades of gold and red. Every afternoon, the residents gathered on the front porch to drink tea, tell stories, and laugh about memories that once brought them pain. One evening, Daniel sat beside me on the porch. "Dad," he said softly, "there's something I've wanted to ask you for years." I looked at him. "When we asked you to leave, did you hate us?" The question hung in the cool evening air. I took a slow breath before answering. "No." He looked surprised. "I was heartbroken," I admitted. "But hatred would have chained me to the worst day of my life. I wanted to be free." Daniel lowered his head. "I don't know if I could have done the same." "You don't have to," I replied. "You only have to make sure your children never repeat our mistakes." A few weeks later, the town council announced that Second Chance House would receive a Community Legacy Award for its work supporting elderly people who had been abandoned or left alone. At the ceremony, reporters asked me to give a speech. I stepped to the podium and looked across the audience. Many of the faces smiling back at me were people who had once believed my life was over when I left my family. They had been wrong. I smiled and began. "People often ask me how I rebuilt my life after losing everything. The truth is, I didn't rebuild my old life. I built a new one. A better one. Sometimes the hardest goodbye becomes the first step toward the life you were meant to live. And if someone tells you that you're no longer needed, don't spend your life trying to prove your worth to them. Spend your life becoming the person you were always meant to be." When I finished, the entire hall stood and applauded. I looked toward the front row. Daniel was clapping with tears in his eyes. Emily smiled proudly. Linda quietly whispered, "That's the man I should have stood beside all those years ago." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I returned to the garden behind Second Chance House. The stars filled the sky. I took Arthur's old pocket watch from my coat pocket. It had stopped ticking years ago, but I carried it anyway. Not to tell time, to remember that every moment we are given is a chance to choose kindness over bitterness, forgiveness over revenge, and hope over despair. I closed the watch and smiled. For the first time in many years, there was nothing left to regret. Only gratitude. The story that began with rejection had become a story of redemption. And the legacy we built together would continue long after we were gone. 10 years after the doors of Second Chance House first opened, it had become more than a shelter. It had become a symbol of hope. People traveled from different towns just to see the place where forgotten parents found a second family. Volunteers filled the halls with music, children painted colorful murals on the walls, and birthdays that had once passed in silence were celebrated with laughter. One bright spring morning, Daniel walked into my office carrying a folder. "Dad," he said with a smile, "I think it's time." "Time for what?" He placed the folder on my desk. Inside were architectural drawings. Across the top was written, "Second Chance House, New Community Center." I looked up in surprise. "We've raised enough donations to build another one." Emily stepped into the room behind him. "This time, it won't just help seniors. It will also offer counseling for families before relationships fall apart." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The very people who had once broken our family were now helping save others. Life had truly come full circle. Construction began that summer. Every weekend, volunteers arrived with paintbrushes, tools, and building supplies. Children planted flowers around the entrance. Local businesses donated furniture. Even people who had never met us wanted to help after hearing our story. One afternoon, while watching the workers, a teenage boy approached me. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course. My grandfather lives here. He says you changed his life." I smiled gently. "I only gave him a place where he could feel loved." The boy shook his head. "No, you gave me my grandfather back." His words touched my heart more deeply than any award ever could. Months later, the new community center officially opened. Families gathered from across the county. The mayor cut the ribbon, but before anyone entered, Daniel handed me a small wooden plaque. It read, "Founded in honor of every parent who was forgotten, and every family brave enough to find their way back." I traced the engraved words with my fingers. Then I looked at my children. Years ago, I had left them behind in silence. Now they stood beside me, not because they had to, but because they chose to. That choice meant everything. As the celebration came to an end, my youngest granddaughter ran up and slipped her tiny hand into mine. Grandpa, yes, sweetheart, when I grow up, can I help people here too? I smiled, kneeling beside her. You already are. She looked confused. How? By caring. That's where every great change begins. She wrapped her arms around me. The entire family watched with quiet smiles. The pain that had once defined us had become the foundation of something beautiful. I looked toward the sunset, remembering the lonely man who had walked away with one suitcase and a broken heart. If I could speak to that man now, I would tell him, don't give up. One day, your greatest loss will become your greatest purpose. And with that thought, I knew the story wasn't really about betrayal. It was about hope, because sometimes, the door that closes behind you is the very one that leads you to the life you were always meant to find. Nearly 15 years had passed since the day I walked out of my family's house with one suitcase. My hair had turned completely white. My hands, once strong enough to rebuild engines, now moved a little slower. But every morning, I still walked through the gardens of Second Chance House, greeting every resident by name. One quiet Monday morning, there was an unexpected knock at the front gate. A young woman stood there holding the hand of a little boy. She looked nervous. Are you Mr. David? I am. My name is Sarah. My father told me to come here if I ever needed hope. I frowned gently. Who's your father? She handed me an old photograph. The moment I saw it, I smiled. It was Michael, the young man who had visited years earlier after his grandfather had lived with us. He told me this place changes lives, Sarah said. I didn't believe him. Tears welled in her eyes. But I don't know where else to go. She explained that after losing her husband, she had fallen into debt. She was working 2 jobs while raising her 6-year-old son alone. They had no relatives willing to help. I knelt beside the little boy. What's your name? Ethan, he whispered. Are you scared? He nodded. I smiled warmly. You don't have to be anymore. I opened the gate. Welcome home. Within weeks, Sarah found work at the community center. The residents adored Ethan. Every afternoon, he ran through the gardens, making everyone laugh. One resident taught him chess. Another showed him how to grow tomatoes. Someone else helped him with homework. For the first time since losing his father, Ethan smiled without pretending. Watching him reminded me of my own children when they were young. One evening, Daniel stood beside me, watching Ethan play. Dad, I finally understand something. What is it? When we told you to leave, I thought family meant the people who lived under the same roof. He shook his head, but family is really the people who refuse to let you face life alone. I smiled. It took us a long road to learn that. Months later, the town unveiled a new stone monument in front of the community center. It wasn't a statue, just a simple granite wall with one sentence carved into it. No one is ever too old, too broken, or too forgotten to deserve a second chance. As the crowd applauded, I looked at Daniel, Emily, Linda, Sarah, Ethan, and the dozens of residents whose lives had become part of ours. I realized that the greatest legacy isn't measured by wealth or success. It's measured by the number of people who feel less alone because you were here. I smiled quietly. The journey that began with rejection had become a lifetime of hope, and that hope would continue long after I was gone. 20 years had passed. Second Chance House had grown into a network of homes across the state. Thousands of elderly people had found comfort, friendship, and dignity because one broken family had chosen to turn its greatest mistake into a mission. I was 81 years old. Walking had become slower, but I still insisted on making my morning rounds. Every resident greeted me with a smile. To them, I wasn't the founder. I was simply David. One autumn afternoon, my entire family gathered in the garden. Daniel had organized a celebration without telling me why. Children were running across the lawn. Grandchildren laughed around the old oak tree. Former residents and volunteers filled every chair. I looked around in confusion. What's all this for? Daniel smiled. For you. Emily stepped forward holding a beautifully bound book. Its title read, The Man Who Never Closed the Door. Inside were hundreds of letters. Letters from residents, volunteers, children, and families whose lives had been changed by Second Chance House. One by one, they shared their memories. A retired teacher wrote, You reminded me that growing old doesn't mean becoming invisible. A young nurse wrote, working here taught me that kindness can heal wounds medicine never could. Sarah wrote, you didn't just save my son and me. You gave us a future. Even Ethan, now a young man preparing for college, had written a letter. You taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about helping someone else stand after you do. By the time I reached the last page, tears blurred my vision. Daniel stood before everyone. Dad, years ago I told you we didn't need you anymore. His voice trembled. I've spent the rest of my life trying to become the kind of man you always believed I could be. He handed me an old, worn envelope. It was the note I had left behind on the day I walked away. It still read, I hope life gives you peace. Daniel smiled through tears. It did, but only because you chose forgiveness instead of revenge. As the sun began to set, my grandchildren gathered around me. Grandpa, the youngest asked, what's the secret to a happy life? I looked at every face around me. The family that had once fallen apart. The strangers who had become family. The home built from heartbreak. Then I answered softly, never stop opening your heart. People will disappoint you. They'll misunderstand you. Some may even leave you. But if you let bitterness lock every door inside you, you'll never welcome the people who truly belong. The garden fell silent. Everyone understood. That evening, I sat alone on the front porch as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Arthur's old pocket watch rested in my hand. It had never worked again. But I no longer wished it did. Because it reminded me that time isn't measured by ticking seconds. It's measured by the love we leave behind. I looked toward the stars and smiled. The man who had once walked away with one suitcase had never imagined this life. And yet, it was the life he had always deserved.